Aloha mai kako. I'm Priscila Leal. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. This is a guest presentation on the topic of critical language literacy for the course English 354 Second Language Writing taught by Dr. Yasmine Romero at the University of Hawaii at West Oahu. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the ancestral lands of the native Hawaiian people in which I live, learn, and teach. I honor the Kanaka Maoli by sharing their wisdom in the form of Olelo no Eao, or proverb, which is Aohe pau ka ike i ka halau ho'okahi. All knowledge is not taught in the same school, which means one can learn from many sources. And I think this Olelo no Eao is very appropriate for this session because critical literacy has to do with being open to learn from different sources, listen from different people, and also to continuously be open to continuously learn. So let's talk about critical literacy. In the next 4 slides, I'll briefly share with you the who, what, where, when, and why, and how of critical literacy. This will be just a brief introduction to the topic because you can read it about it online. There are several interesting books. I'm sure you've already read a chapter or two about it. And also at the end of the presentation, I share with you some references and suggestions for further reading. And you can also go there and get more informed on the theoretical underpinnings of this on this theoretical concept. But one of the most common comments that I hear about critical literacy is that there's not enough examples of how to do it or of how it looks like in the classroom. And so I'd like to spend most of our time on the how. And again, I encourage you to learn more about the history and the theoretical underpinnings of critical literacy by browsing my references and resources slides at the end of this presentation. Well, meet Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator, philosopher, and activist. Freire believed that reading the words was not enough, but that one needed to read the world to understand how meaning is socially constructed within texts and the political and economic context in which the texts are created and embedded. So reading the words meaning decoding and reading the world understanding how it's socially constructed. And so he believes that by doing that, one can act to change socially unjust contexts. He was a really neat guy who ended up being exiled for 10 years during the military dictatorship because of his work, which means it was working. Now, let's talk about the what and the why. Keep in mind there are many definitions to critical literacy, and as I mentioned before, one can learn from many sources. I want to share with you this one by Vasquez, which is critical literacy is about imagining thoughtful ways of thinking about reconstructing and redesigning texts, images, and practices. And the goal is to convey different and more socially just and equitable messages and ways of being that have real life effects and real world impact. So if we take a closer look at this quote, we can highlight some keywords here or clues that will lead us to the how. The first one being imagining, the next one being more socially just, and the third word being real world impact. So I pulled out these keywords and I'm connecting them to some steps that can lead us to how to do critical literacy in the classroom. And so these terms can give us suggestions on how to proceed. So if we look at imagining, we can become aware of how things are represented in the text. And so noticing how these representations take place in the text. When we look at more socially just, we can lead it to questioning how these representations, which are often deemed as common sense and discourses and ideology, so we can start to question these representations. And lastly, real world impact has to do with acting to challenge and potentially change these representations and how they are done. So right now, everything is a very abstract level, which is why I'd like to take a moment to walk you through and show you how we can do that. My advice to do this is to really start small and simple with something that's already familiar to your students so that they can learn the mechanics of being asked of what is being asked of them. This is so that when they approach more complex abstract texts or topics any difficulties that you'll have can be related to the topic and not to the task itself. And so, what are we asking our students to do? So, we're asking them to notice and disrupt the commonplace, meaning we want to challenge the learners to closely examine the familiar through new lenses and includes considering new ways of looking at old ideas. We want to invite them to question. We want to interrogate multiple viewpoints, which requires us to put ourselves into the positions and perspectives of others, but also to focus and question social political issues, to challenge us to explore the institutional systems and the power relationships and the language embedded within these systems. And lastly, we want to encourage them to act, to take action and promote social justice. Take an informed stand against oppression, promoting social justice. So, with these in mind, let me walk you through an exercise. As I said, my advice is to start with something that is already familiar to the student so that they can learn the mechanics of what is being asked of them. In our case, I've chosen a product I'll assume most of us has used one time or another, and that is a razor. So the first step is to notice or become aware of how things are represented in the text. And so what do you notice? I encourage you to look at the colors, fonts, images, but also the words that are used. Sometimes it's easier to notice things when we have a reference to compare and contrast. So let me add another image to help us notice these things. So now that we have two, we can really look into both and notice, for example, the colors. One is purple, the other is blue. We can notice the font. The one on the left in purple has swirly fonts. The right has more blocky fonts. We can notice the images that are being used. The one on the right with the blue has a wave. We can also notice the shape of the product, how the one on the right is more blocky and the one on the left is a little more round. I'm sure you've noticed other things too, but for now, let's use this information to go to the next step, which is to question. Now that we've noticed how things are represented, we can start to question these representations, which again are often deemed as common sense or discourses in ideology. So, for example, why is one purple and the other blue? My cultural background tells me that purple is targeted to women and blue to men. Why? Because these are the colors often associated with binary genders. Why does the man show a wave? Again, my cultural background makes me relate wave to sports and adventure, and that is something that's associated with men, or at least that's the message here. Women, on the other hand, are delicate. Notice the swirly font. But what if you're transgender or non binary or simply does not identify with these representations of women and men? So, what, you might ask? Well, here's where things start getting interesting. Did you know that most products targeted to women consumers are more expensive than the equivalent to men? So now we are at the institutional system level where women who work and therefore often make less money than men, that's the gender gap, they make less money and yet they pay more for the same products as men. Now, you might be wondering, now that we've noticed and we have asked, the next step would be to act, to challenge and potentially change these representations. There's a particular term for the phenomenon of women paying more for certain products as same as men, and it's called the pink text. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but if you look at it from a female male standpoint or women and men standpoint, women spend over $1,000 more than men would spend on these. But what would happen if women become more aware of this? What would happen if women stopped buying women's products and instead bought men's products? Or what if the products were gender neutral? I mean, is that such a radical idea? Anyway, this is the pink text. And since we're talking about gender pricing, did you know that products like tampon and other feminine hygiene products are considered luxury items in Hawaii and in several other states as well, and therefore they have higher tax? Well, I don't know about you, but for me, these aren't luxury items. These are basic necessity products. Now that we know how, we can change the topic to something more complex or abstract. And I've chosen here a couple of clippings from newspapers. And so we'll start with noticing. And I'd like you to take a moment to become aware of how things are represented in the text. So take a few seconds to look at the different pictures, look at the different texts, and see how things are represented. So this is what I noticed. On the top, we have a young black male in the picture. In the bottom, we have a young white male and female in the picture. They're both in flooded waters. This is from Hurricane Katrina. What I also noticed is the language used on the top, which refers to the young man looting a grocery store. In the bottom, it says finding bread. Now that we've noticed, let's question these representations. What is the common sense? What is the discourse? What is the message or the hidden message, you could say, that's present in these clippings? One could say, in time of need, white people find food, but perhaps the only way black people get food is by looting. That could be one of the messages. I'm sure you can think of other messages, but we stay with this right now, just for the sake of the exercise. Lastly, we talk about acting. So how can we act to challenge and potentially change the representations that we see that show socially unjust? And that's a misrepresentation. It's a racial representation. Well, there's several ways we can do this. We can help others become aware by posting this on social media and calling attention to it. We can call out the author who posted it in the comment section. We can, what else? The point here is that the students come up with suggestions, not the instructor. We want to encourage them to notice, we want to encourage them to question, and we want to encourage them to think about ways that we can act to change these representations. And so I encourage you to think of ideas and share them among each other. Now that we've done it, you might still be wondering how to do this with my students or kids. Again, my advice is that you start small with something already familiar to them. Again, we want them to be comfortable with the mechanics first before exploring more complex and abstract topics. So here's my suggestion: toys. So let's start with noticing. Take a moment to become aware of how things are represented. So we have two boxes of Lego toys. On the left, I noticed the word friends using swirly fonts with colors predominantly pink, purple, and such shades. On the right, it's a Star Wars Lego box with block letters, action-packed adventure. Oh, I forgot to mention, in the second, it's a hairdresser studio from the looks of it. So, now that we've noticed, we begin to question. Let's question the representations that we see. What is the hidden message? What is the ideology that's present? One could say that girls grow up to be hairdressers and boys grow up to go on space adventures. That would be one of the messages we could argue. And lastly, how can we act to challenge and potentially change these representations? Is there anything that can be done? Again, the point here is that the students come up with suggestions, not the instructor. And so you might be wondering what can kids come up with? Well, let me share with you what Charlotte, a 7-year-old girl, did. She wrote a letter to Lego, complaining, telling about her trip to the aisle and finding that there weren't many girl figurines, and the ones that there were, they were doing very domesticated activities. And she called Lego out. Interestingly enough, not too long afterwards, in fact, if I remember correctly, in less than a year, Lego responded and released a new set of women scientists. So perhaps not all the actions that we take will see immediate um, reframing of these representations or fixing of these representations. But I think the lesson here is to show our students that we can be active citizens and that we can do things rather than just sit quietly and accept them. So again, the question is, how do we do this in the classroom? Well, the students are comfortable with the mechanics. They've done a trial with a few toys or a few different items. Now we can move on to books. Are you familiar with the rainbow fish? If not, you can go to YouTube and read it along. But the story of the rainbow fish is a fish with shiny, multicolored scales, and the other fish from his group also have scales, but only scales that match their real colors. However, they wish that they had the shiny silver scales like the rainbow fish. One day, a small blue fish, wishing he could have shiny silver scales, asks the rainbow fish if he could have one of his shiny scales. The rainbow fish refuses in a very rude manner. The small blue fish tells all the other fish that the rainbow fish was being rude, and as a result, the other fish do not want to play with him anymore. His only remaining friend, the starfish, tells him to go visit the octopus for advice. Then, the octopus gives the rainbow fish her advice. He must share his skills with the other fish. She continues that he might no longer be the most beautiful fish after that, but he will discover how to be happy. The rainbow fish immediately says he cannot share his scales, but before the octopus could say anything, he rudely or she rudely disappears in a cloud of ink. When the rainbow fish encounters the little blue fish for a second time, the rainbow fish shares one of his precious silver scales and sees the little fish's joy. Very soon, the rainbow fish is surrounded by the other fish requesting scales, and he shares one of his shiny silver scales with each one of them. Soon, everyone in the ocean has a shiny scale, including the rainbow fish. The rainbow fish is finally happy, even though he only had one shiny scale left. This is the gist of the story. Well, let's question the messages that are being sent here. Things that we can ask. Have you ever owned an item that you didn't want to share? If you were made to share, did it make you happier or sadder? Do you think you should ever have to choose between having something special or having friends? Is being unique more important than being liked? Other questions that I can think of is, are these true friends if one of the main reasons they like you is because you give them something? Notice that these questions actually might be in conflict. These hidden messages might be in conflict with certain family and cultural backgrounds. We have families that will value sharing above all else, and we will have families that value individuality, independence, and ownership. And so being aware of how the children come with these values to the classroom is really important because it really will help us understand when they start suggesting the actions. So one of the things that we can encourage the students or see if they come up with is to share these new notices in their home and ask advice from adults. So I want to remind you that the first issue in the story of the rainbow fish was that when the little blue fish, the first time he asked the rainbow fish for a scale, a shiny scale, and the rainbow fish response was rude. And that, I think, is the issue here. And so, can we think of other things that the rainbow fish could have said instead of being rude when fish asked for the scales? So we can talk about politeness and respect and acceptance and hearing no as an answer. We can also ask the students or as a group to retell and rewrite the story. And that's exactly what one artist did. She created and published an alternative ending to the story. which I'd like to share with you. So this story starts after the octopus advice, right? Now the rainbow fish meets the catfish, who is super popular apparently because of its dinner parties. The catfish asks the rainbow fish what was the advice, and the catfish questions the source. The catfish says, "We do not take life advice from reclusive cephalopods who live alone in the dark caves." And so this is, for me, it's a really great way of questioning, helping the students see, wait, who are you getting advice from? And do they have the credentials for that? Next, the catfish's advice is to now, instead of being rude, is to help find what is unique in each creature. And he says, when you celebrate what makes each of us distinctive, you become part of a community. So all of a sudden, we're reframing the idea of giving up who you are to please others into noticing what makes each one distinctive. And the fish goes on to meet with crabs and all different sea creatures and lobsters, and he exercises how to do that and notice what's unique in each creature. Now, I love the message of this rewritten text because it's important to consider the feelings of others, but you should never feel obligated to diminish yourself for someone else's comfort. So it's no longer just about the sharing, it's to do with diminishing who you are. And you know what? You can start the cycle all over again by noticing, questioning the messages in this new text, and doing all the things again with your students to see what hidden messages were in the rewritten text. So there's no one way to do critical literacy. What makes it critical is the connection with our social worlds and interrogating the representations and the messages that are hidden in the text, and our efforts to bring attention to these representations and to challenge them. Again, you can read more about critical literacy by clicking on these links. It's been a pleasure sharing with you. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, feedback, gifts, or compliments, all of which I'll gladly accept, feel free to send me an email. Shoot.